The miscalculations made by the executives of Six Flags Corporation during the early 2000s were so clear to see in hindsight. Everything was doomed to fail, and it shouldn't have been much of a surprise when they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy at the tail end of the decade. The root of the cause would seem to be the rampant and excessive spending they had undertaken in the late 90s and early aughts, and the purchase of two particular theme parks had proven to have backfired the very worst. Six Flags Astroworld and Six Flags New Orleans were doomed from the start, but we just had no idea how bad the end would be.
Touched the walls of a city streets and didn't explain, sadly showed us our ways. I've never asked him why. Cast down, it was heaven sent, and to the church, no intent to repent. On my knees, just to cry. Until you travel to that place you can
The idea of an amusement park in the Houston area is one that dates all the way back to the early 20th century, back when amusement parks and roller coasters were still in their infancy. In that time, Houston was a rapidly growing city of less than 100,000 inhabitants. It was quickly becoming the go-to city to move to in South Texas, as it was further inland than their main competitor, Galveston. The 1900 Galveston hurricane devastated the island, and set the precedent that Galveston was a much more unsafe place to park cargo ships in. While the city was still reeling from the loss of over 8,000 citizens, on top of the millions of dollars in property damage lost, Houston was still thriving. However, Galveston didn't magically disappear. It was still the main place to go to for tourists, hotels, beaches, and amusement parks. The Buccaneer Hotel in Galveston was one of its most iconic buildings. In front of it was the beach, alongside the Crystal Palace, an elevated pier that housed bowling, a dance floor, a swimming pool, and an open-air amphitheater. It was a marvel of the city and attracted thousands of tourists every day. Behind the hotel stood Crystal Palace Park and its roller coaster, Mountain Speedway. Mountain Speedway was far from a unique roller coaster. It was one of hundreds of figure-8 models that used to pop up at just about every amusement park in the world. This was mainly because back in the turn of the century, roller coasters were extremely elementary. Importantly, there weren't any seatbelts, which weren't regularly used on roller coasters until the 1920s. And there also weren't any upstop wheels, which kept the train on the track when making sharp turns or sizable drops. The coaster stood for over 50 years until it finally closed in 1961. The next step in the theme park evolution was Luna Park Houston. Instead of being located way down in Galveston, it was located right up there next to all of the skyscrapers. You could even see the park's star attraction when looking at views of downtown Houston, which by the mid-1920s was rapidly becoming the powerhouse of Texas. The 1930 census had revealed that Houston had surpassed Dallas in population, and it never looked back. And of course, the bigger, the better, right? If this were true, then Giant Skyrocket would be one of the world's best roller coasters. It was marketed as the biggest and highest coaster in the world. Whether this was actually true or not remains a mystery, but its 90-foot drop was certainly nothing to laugh about at the time. Luna Park Houston had just about everything. Even if we erase the giant 6,600-foot-long coaster from its repertoire, it had much more to show, like a carousel, bumper cars, a massive pavilion that was claimed to be the largest in the South, a Ferris wheel, and a midget show. If that wasn't enough for you, try some boxing or dancing competitions that offer over $12,000 in today's money as the first place prize. It was too good to be true. The Great Depression hit the United States hard. Nobody was spared from the economic downturn triggered by a massive loss in the stock market. All of a sudden, many of the activities people had the luxury to spend on were viewed as an afterthought, especially since getting food on the table would now become a struggle for millions of people, not only in the United States, but around the world, which was gearing up to be the stage for the biggest war ever to that point. If the Great Depression didn't render amusement parks useless, then World War II certainly did. The regular flow of new coasters opening up had just about dried up in the 1930s, and in the early 1940s had completely dried out. Parks simply did not have the visitors like they used to, and thereby did not have the money like they did in the 20s. Luna Park suffered the same fate that many other amusement parks over the globe faced. It was time to move on. The great theme park experiment was coming to a close. Even after the war had ended, people were still reeling from all that had happened in the past decade and a half. Amusement parks were slowly coming back into the regular person's peripheral, but Houston was left with practically nothing but scraps. Giant Skyrocket had found itself a new home down the street, but there wasn't much else, and for a city this big, growing this swiftly, Houston really needed something to invigorate its interest in not solely amusement parks, but for other mediums of entertainment such as sports. It is time we meet our hero. Roy Hofheinz, who I imagine to be some sort of folk hero to many in the Houston area, is most responsible for continuing this story. Though he was definitely not alone, his heroics led to one of the greatest architectural feats of the 20th century, the Astrodome. It started when a group known as the Houston Sports Association dedicated themselves to bringing professional baseball to the city of Houston. They strong-armed and orated their way into landing themselves and the city their very own baseball team, appropriately named the Colt 45s. The Colt 45s played their first couple of seasons in the Colt Stadium, which wasn't very impressive and was not supposed to be their permanent home. This was because Roy Hofheinz was investing truckloads of money into an extremely ambitious project. It was to be the first domed stadium in the world. It was the Astrodome. What exactly did the Astrodome have that other sports venues did not? It had a scoreboard, artificial turf, and that aforementioned illustrious dome. During this time, Houston was sort of rebranding itself into a whole new city that couldn't even exist in the previous decade. It was dedicated to becoming the shining beacon of space travel after the Manned Spacecraft Center opened in Houston in 1961, and was the catalyst for Houston's excessive theming related to the stars, celestial objects, or outer space, which, hey, is the exact definition of astro in the dictionary. The Colt 45s were renamed to the Astros. They played in their new stadium, the Astrodome, and they still weren't quite done with the Astro names. Roy Hofheinz owned 116 acres around the Astrodome and wanted to make good use of that land. So, he built an Astrodomain. 1, 2, 3, 4 hotels, a convention center, and, for good measure, a theme park. On the 1st of June in 1968, Astroworld opened to the public. It opened with 8 themed areas, the first of which was Americana Square, which we can tell was inspired by Disney World's Main Street entrance. This area did not have any attractions unless you consider overpriced food and gift shops to be attractions. Moving from the entrance plaza, there wasn't much more at first glance. The Oriental Corner pretty much only had a train station, but it served the important purpose of allowing people from across the park to ride back to the front of the park and vice versa. Right above sat the Plaza de Fiesta, which sported an indoor-themed boat ride. Impressive, but there wasn't much more in that area. The Western Junction area more than made up for the lack of quantity in the previous areas. Being on the opposite side of the park from Oriental Corner, it was the best spot for another train station. But unlike Oriental, it had more to offer, like a shooting gallery, maritime bumper cars, a Trabant, and a theater named after the one and only Crystal Palace. It was paying homage to what very well could have been forgotten by most, as it closed all the way back in 1941. To the right was the European Village, which featured a massive 340-foot tall rotating observation tower and, Le Taxi, the French taxi car ride. Again scooting to the right, we find ourselves in a new area, the Alpine Valley. It contained a carousel and some themed sleigh ride that I'll talk more about later. Below Alpine Valley rested Modville to round everything out with a ginormous, first-of-its-kind double Ferris wheel, which allowed for one wheel to be loaded with passengers while the other was cycling. It also had Le Taxi without the French theming, so that's a plus. The eighth and final section was the kids area, Children's World, which featured a petting zoo and a teacup ride. So, that, as of 1968, is Astroworld in its entirety. The next year, 2 more attractions opened in Oriental Corner, those being a log flume ride and Astroworld's first ever roller coaster. It was nothing too crazy, just a simple 20-foot kiddie coaster. The next year brought more major changes to the park, as the first new area, Fun Island, opened in 1970. It was jam-packed right in between Oriental and Plaza de Fiesta, and featured Astroworld's second roller coaster. Standing over 2.5 times taller than Serpent, Swamp Buggy was most definitely not a kiddie coaster. It brung that sort of spiraling down a tower vibe to the park that those with motion sickness didn't really like. Despite its rather odd look, there were at least another 36 of these to exist, including 2 that are still operating as of 2023. 1972 also brought major changes to the park, as the 10th themed area, Country Fair, opened towards the front of the park. It featured yet another roller coaster, this one being an Aero Mine Train called Whatever This Is. I have looked up Dexter Frebish and could find no sources confirming who this was or that they even existed. Maybe they pulled this name out of a bag, maybe not. Whatever the case, the coaster itself was almost as weird as the name. It fell victim to the era in which it was designed. Transitions like this would never exist in this day and age, but that's enough about Astroworld. What's up with Houston? Houston is in a pretty interesting place in this time period. The early 70s brought upon a number of changes in America, as the Cold War reached its coolest point yet after President Richard Nixon visited China and temporarily banned the use of nuclear weapons. Speaking of Nixon, oh geez. Well, we stopped sending people to the moon, and most importantly for the context of this video, there was an oil crisis. The oil crisis had pretty much shriveled up the world's ability to import oil from Arabian countries, leading to increased prices and the ramped up production of oil elsewhere, such as in not as oil-rich but still pretty oil-rich places like Texas to take its place for the time being. This led to job opportunities. Job opportunities led to more residents generally led to increased revenues. Ever since the 1960s, Houston has been growing at a rate most American cities could only dream of and was on its way to becoming one of the pinnacles of American culture. As seen in this image, the downtown was more parking lot than anything else, but despite the inefficient land use, the city was managing well with the population growth, sporting a few new neighbors to the Astros. First, it was the NFL's Houston Oilers, and then the NBA's Houston Rockets. The theater district saw massive development, and Houston's skyline, which in 2023 is the 4th tallest in the United States, was starting to take its current shape. But perhaps atop all of that was the growth and expansion of its much beloved theme park, where we will finally talk about Alpine Sleigh Ride. It traversed riders through a forest and into an artificial mountain and through icy caverns and a waterfall that you could see from outside. To further the immersion, the ride was kept cool at all times to lessen or even eliminate the effects of the battering Texas sun. All is well. Yep, okay. We were getting to you. Hold your horses. You are going to prove yourself to be impulsive, destructive, and downright idiotic at times. And you are going to make some decisions that I do not personally like. But, everyone welcome Six Flags. It probably shouldn't have been too much of a surprise that a corporation was going to take charge of such a successful theme park, and it also shouldn't really be too surprising that the buyer was Six Flags. It was based in Texas and had previously built 2 theme parks from the ground up, so
this whole acquisition thing should really be a breeze in comparison. Astroworld, now called Six Flags Astroworld, already had a foundation. Hell, they had way more than just the foundation. But on the other side of the country, there was another theme park that was crumbling. The Coney Island Cyclone in New York has a good chance at being the most famous coaster ever built, and unfortunately for many, there was a good chance that it would close in the 1970s. Rising maintenance costs, coupled with safety concerns, had the crows circling around the coaster as fans prepared for its imminent demise. Astroworld executives attempted to purchase and relocate the coaster, but didn't due to high costs. So, they did the next best thing. They made their own.
It didn't take long for the Texas Cyclone to be heralded as one of the best roller coasters on Earth. It was practically a mirror image of the original Cyclone, but people loved it. It opened in yet another themed area, the Coney Island section of the park, but other than the Texas Cyclone, it didn't offer much more. Next year, Maudeville was renamed to International Plaza, and an aqua theater was added in between Plaza de Fiesta and Western Junction. About 250 feet away from the theater stood Greased Lightning. It was the first launch coaster to be added to the park, as well as being the fastest and tallest added to the park, and the first to invert, meaning it turned riders upside down. The first inverting coaster had opened in the 1840s, but within the past couple of years, the inverted coaster had become, for the first time ever, safe for riders, as the emergence of the steel coaster allowed for more stable reinforcements. We'll pick it up in the next decade when Astroworld dropped the curtains for the world's first ever River Rapids ride. It was arguably the most influential attraction to ever open in Astroworld, and was cloned in many different variations around the world. Thunder River was finally when Astroworld made big ripples in the realm of theme parks. It was not just a park that served those in the Houston area, but it was a mainstay. If you've ever ridden a River Rapids ride, you could partially thank Astroworld, more specifically, then General Manager Bill Crandall being inspired by watching kayak racing and thinking, I could turn this into a thrilling new attraction. The construction of Thunder Rapids coincided with the construction of Houston's premier water park and future section of the park, Waterworld. In 1983, Astroworld welcomed Skyscreamer, a freefall tower, and said goodbye to Alpine Sleigh Ride in favor of Batman: The Escape. This forces me to talk about Six Flags. Six Flags acquired Marriott's Great America, which in turn gave them rights to Time Warner's characters. That gave them rights to all characters from the DC universe, as well as characters from the Looney Tunes, which they made very apparent. How apparent? Well, they have operated 17 different coasters that have included Batman in the title, on top of another 17 that included Superman in the title. That is a tiny slice of the pie that I'll call milking the IP. While still on the topic of Six Flags, I'll also have to mention that they are growing at an incredible rate at this point in time. After acquiring Astroworld, they then went on to purchase Great Adventure and Magic Mountain, and added many attractions to all of their parks. I feel inclined to go a little more in depth with Batman: The Escape than with the previous coasters. So after cresting the lift hill, it turned and dropped into a loop followed by a left turn. After a little airtime hill, it turned right into some mid-course brakes and dropped into a couple of banked turns, this one being really sluggish. One turn and it's back to the station. It doesn't seem too crazy, until you realize you're supposed to ride it standing up. And looking at how shaky the camera was, I don't really even want to think about riding it. In 1984, a new coaster named Accelerate opened. After the failure of the Bat from Kings Island, Arrow wanted to retry their idea of a swinging suspension coaster, and Astroworld was the location for the second ever Arrow suspended coaster. With the Bat being marred by a plethora of maintenance issues, Arrow worked very hard to ensure that there would not be a repeat, and thankfully, there was not. Accelerate ran pretty well throughout its time at the park. Just a few years after its opening, another coaster opened, that being Viper. And with that, we officially enter which weren't quite as busy as the 1980s, but still started off with a new attraction called Ultra Twister.
which looks extremely confusing but isn't actually as complex as it presents itself. The train lies between these two pipes that are attached to the rings. If the pipes roll, the train rolls like this. It also featured a rare at the time vertical lift, but didn't really offer much more, just meandering around for most of the layout. Mayan Mindbender opened in 1995 and was a themed indoor coaster, which looked like this outside. 3 years later, Texas Tornado arrived from Europe. It was a coaster that had traveled across fairs in Germany before being moved to Sweden, then Astroworld. It featured the most inversions in the park, tallying 4 loops and nauseating thousands of riders a day. The very next year, they got yet another coaster, but it was a hunk of junk. There are a bunch of these that exist, and almost none of them are good. During its peak, 20 of them opened in just a 3-year span, more than any other coaster model in history. At the forefront of this war crime to the theme park industry was Six Flags, who will be talked about further soon. Dungeon Drop opened in 1998, which was kind of the sequel to Skyscreamer, which had opened 15 years prior. And after it opened, that was it for the 90s in Astroworld. If it seems like a lot less than what happened in the 80s, you'd be correct. But the reason as to why the decade was so uneventful in the park was not what one might expect. Six Flags, in the 1990s, is going bonkers.
And it started with a small real estate company in Oklahoma. In 1984, Tierco Incorporated bought the rundown Frontier Park, and after plans of converting the park into a shopping center fell through, they decided they were going to reinvest some $13 million into improving the park, and it paid huge dividends. The park's revenue quadrupled, and the company found itself a new opportunity: get into the theme park business. It sold all of its pre-existing property to gain money and invested that money into Frontier City, which saw the additions of Looping Star in 1986, Wildcat in 1991, and Diamondback in 1994. Though the coasters weren't that great, they were the only ones that the residents of Oklahoma City had for miles and miles. Away stood the failing Wild World in the outskirts of Washington, D.C. Tierco saw this as an opportunity to expand and pounced on it. They added a few new coasters to the park and generally turned it around as well. They were pretty good at this theme park thing, so they renamed themselves to Premier Parks to signify that they were moving on from real estate and shifting their focus to developing theme parks. After this, they purchased Funtime, and because of that, acquired 3 parks in the Rust Belt, and of course, started adding attractions to those parks as well. The acquisitions did not slow down. They acquired Elitch Gardens in Denver and Riverside Park in Massachusetts. After all that build-up, they acquired Six Flags on April 1st, 1998. The reason they were able to spend so much money is because Premier went public and raised tens of millions of dollars. Six Flags, for its part, was doing quite well during the 90s before being purchased by Premier. They themselves began to manage Fiesta Texas down in San Antonio and even purchased the park in 1998. In the next millennium, they started to expand internationally for the first time, buying parks in Madrid and the Netherlands. This isn't even including the parks they had closed by this time, like Auto World, an indoor car-themed entertainment facility in Michigan, followed by the slightly more successful power plant in downtown Baltimore. I think it's safe to say that Six Flags has seen a lot of expansion since acquiring Astroworld in 1975. You'd assume that the amount of money spent on buying parks was the vast majority of their spending. But there's something I must reiterate. Six Flags is going bonkers.
New Orleans has had an even longer history of amusement parks than Houston. Its first opened in 1883, older than the first skyscraper and car. By this time, New Orleans was the 10th most populous city in America, but much before then, it made its name off the buying and selling of human beings. New Orleans was built off the back of slavery. In fact, it had the largest slave market in the United States for a time. And even after slavery was abolished in 1865, the city just kept growing. Much like Houston, its port was the main draw. The city had adopted a distinct culture that it still holds on to this day. Creole cuisine, varied architecture, Mardi Gras, Bourbon Street. It was a stark contrast to Houston, which took about a century and some change to give itself more than a little specialization. New Orleans got itself an amusement park before even New York City got one. It was the place to go if you wanted an unquestionably unique, cultured experience in the United States. West End Park opened in 1883 and got its first roller coaster, Switchback Railway, a sort of a beta-type coaster that paved the way for pretty much everything else. Scenic Railway would open in 1998. This photo is a relic. The coaster and the amusement park only existed for 5 more years, and despite the very tiny percentage of people who owned a camera at the time, captured this ungrainy photo of a roller coaster on a pier that would no longer exist in a few decades' time, as
concerns over flooding called for redevelopment of the park in the 20th century. Its role as New Orleans' amusement park was almost immediately taken by Pontchartrain Beach, which opened right before the Great Depression. Unlike Houston's Luna Park, though, it survived through the rough period and even got a shiny new coaster at the very end of the 30s. Throughout the park's lifespan, Zephyr was the main attraction of Pontchartrain Beach. In the 70s, attendance declined and the park was on its last breath. The nail in the coffin was that Lake Pontchartrain was becoming very polluted and drew environmental concerns. The park closed in 1983. For a century, New Orleans has always had at least one extant amusement park, and for the first time since before the car was invented, that was not the case. 16 years later, they got another. Jazzland. To kick off the new millennium, New Orleans welcomed its only existing theme park at the time, and opened it with a family coaster, a wild mouse, a boomerang, and a star attraction. Megazeph was inspired by Zephyr, but was bigger and better. It was 110 feet compared to Zephyr's 80-foot stature. Massive hills and turnarounds defined the coaster. The amusement park had the foundation to succeed, but was not profitable and was put on sale in 2001, where the very next year, an opportunistic Six Flags purchased the park and began operation in 2003, a year in which they added a couple of intense rides and coasters like Jester and Batman the Ride. Things were actually looking up for the park, and for the city that had been robbed bare of amusement parks throughout its history, and more recently, its population. New Orleans had been steadily declining in population for the past couple of decades, primarily due to the loss of jobs brought on by the new automation of porting jobs, coupled with the fact that New Orleans never really had a net to fall back on. If you were a worker, you more than likely worked at the port, and since those porting jobs dwindled, the population followed suit. But that was starting to change in the late 90s due to becoming more dependent on tourism and technology. And let's not forget, the port was still a massive source of income for the city. Around 320 miles away in Houston, Astroworld was existing. It kicked off the new millennium by dismantling the Astro Needle and adding SWAT, a power spin prototype. Other than that, it was pretty quiet in the park. But there were changes made to the area surrounding the park. Houston got a new football team, and along that, a new stadium. The Astros left the Astrodome for Mickey-made Park closer to downtown, leaving the Astrodome vacant as the 2000s began. In 2004, the management team over at Six Flags New Orleans planned for a brand new water park to be built within the coming years, as, I'll tell you again, the park's future was looking bright, as was Astroworld's. The addition of a new NFL stadium meant that yes, there would still be massive crowds waiting for the iconic theme park each year. The two symbols of joy would open their doors for another season. 2005 was another quiet season for both parks, as there were assumed to be new attractions opening in the future. But as we come to know now, That future never ensued.
We're moving west-southwest at 8, and this is the latest official forecast track from the National Hurricane Center. Now, if this track is correct, it comes into a point near the Alabama.
Actually, the smell is actually putrid.
Over 37 years of Houston history have come to a close.
Six Flags Astroworld shut down for good this evening. Well, they said it would happen
How do you laugh and cry at the same time? I don't know. I just did it. I'm going to miss this roller coaster very, very much.
The water started rising in the attic, ma'am. And I'm a child in the attic. And the sun is coming to zone.
And that was it. 37 years of Houston history, plus another 5 years of New Orleans history, gone. It was scary how sudden the deaths of the two parks were. Within just a few short months, both ceased to exist, and for completely different reasons. Astroworld's reason is a little bit more complicated. The park was managing well in the 90s and up until the 2000s. But something odd seemed to be occurring. The attendance, which peaked in '94, was declining year in and year out, despite the constant flow of attractions opening in the park. It wasn't to be blamed on a slowdown of Houston's growth. Houston experienced moderate growth during the 2000s, but Greater Houston, which included the suburban sprawl, grew over 41% over the decade. So it must have been the park itself. Astroworld never really left the 1980s, one guest said. The attractions that opened in the 90s were quite lackluster, and by no means pushed any limits or broke any records. Batman the Escape was a clone, and so was Ultra Twister and Serial Thriller. SWAT was likely Six Flags' last-ditch effort on the park. The somewhat minor attendance issue was exacerbated by rising land value, which we'll cite as the primary cause of Astroworld's closure. The addition of a brand new $350 million retractable roof stadium certainly did no wonders in helping to combat the rising costs. The site of Astroworld was also just horrible in relation to the stadium. A parking arrangement dispute had started brewing between the park and the stadium, and as it turned out, the brand new stadium won that dispute. It also didn't help that Six Flags was in some quite precarious waters due to their excessive spending they undertook years prior. Their recklessness would bite them in the butt, and it would not get better any soon. Perhaps the worst part of all was just how sudden it was for those who regularly attended the park. The public had no way of knowing how soon the end would be, and they had no idea what was coming next. It wasn't just the closure of Astroworld, it was a demolition. Here's Texas Cyclone, once called the best coaster in the world, being torn down. Much of the park's rides and attractions were demolished and never put up again. Some were spared from such a fate, like Mayan Mindbender, which was relocated to a small park in Amarillo, and Serial Thriller, which was relocated to Canada. But disregarding those two coasters, Astroworld simply disappeared. For months, it had sat vacant adjacent to the stadiums. Today, the land that was once occupied by a bustling theme park only exists as a parking lot. It shouldn't have ended like this. Six Flags tried to sell the park for $150 million, but had to settle for just half of that. Ironic considering the value of land was supposed to be so high that Astroworld had to close as a result. Six Flags had completely eradicated a park for cheap change, and still, that was not the worst of it. Just under 4 years after Astroworld's closure, Six Flags would go on to declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy because of their massive debt, and I sure do think the underselling of the Astroworld property played a role. But playing an even bigger role was the destruction of Six Flags New Orleans. The city had been placed in a spot that makes it very vulnerable to potential hurricanes, which is why in the 1930s, workers constructed a levee system to help prevent widespread flooding in case of future events. Future events came in the form of Hurricane Betsy in 1965, which caused considerable flooding to the low-lying areas to the city. This prompted the federal government to expand the levee system in New Orleans. Unfortunately, all of that expanding had little effect on the storm surge of Hurricane Katrina. Katrina made landfall on August 29th, and almost immediately, there were breaches in levees. The system designed to keep water from breaching into below sea level neighborhoods folded in an instant. There was nothing the residents of New Orleans could do. Many left and never came back. Many traveled downtown to the Superdome, which was on higher ground and, miraculously, withstood the hurricane that battered the city. Some stayed, and a large chunk of those who made that decision died. Six Flags New Orleans rested in a very low-lying area. It was right next to Lake Pontchartrain, which overflowed. It was also, incidentally, adjacent to one of the levees that failed in New Orleans that day. The park was flooded with over 6 feet of corrosive water, which wore out and weakened the supports for rides and caused heavy damage to buildings. 11 months later, the damage was assessed, and it was determined that much of the park was damaged beyond repair. Six Flags New Orleans was dead. Of the 6 operating coasters, 4 were damaged beyond repair and have been sitting and rotting away since 2005. Of the 2 that survived, one was a kiddie coaster that was relocated to Magic Mountain in California. The other, Batman the Ride, only survived because it was sitting on an elevated platform that spared it from being drowned in floodwaters. It was relocated to Fiesta, Texas in San Antonio. Obviously, the unexpected closure of Six Flags New Orleans, plus the cost it took to assess the damage, costed Six Flags a ton of money, but it was made even worse due to a lawsuit between them and the city of New Orleans that ultimately resulted in Six Flags only receiving a fraction of the insurance money they were promised. From then, it was only a matter of time until rock bottom. The role of CEO was passed on to Mark Shapiro shortly after the closure of Astroworld. The company sold a few parks like Elitch Gardens and Wild Waves before ultimately declaring bankruptcy a few years later. They opened no new major attractions in 2010 as they were focused on restructuring. Thankfully, Six Flags exited bankruptcy on May 3, 2010, just under a year after they filed. New Orleans was never really the same after Hurricane Katrina. Despite a population increase of over 11% between 2010 and 2020, the population was still more than 100,000 less than pre-Katrina levels. Despite attempts to rebuild and move on, a bleak reminder of disaster still exists in the corpse of Six Flags New Orleans. The park still lies there, abandoned despite the best efforts of people who wanted to buy the property. Sunshine Star was the first to take interest in the site in 2009. They planned to not only reopen the park, but expand it to almost double its previous pre-storm size. Plans for the park were eventually dropped and forgotten about. They were almost immediately replaced by proposals to convert the park into a power plant for the city, and then a mall. The mall was seriously being considered as a successor to the plot, until the plans were suddenly scrapped due to potential competition with another expanding mall called Riverwalk Marketplace. In 2011, another proposal to bring back Jazzland didn't go anywhere. Neither did yet another proposal to convert the park into a themed resort. It seemed as if nothing could replace the original Jazzland. In the meantime, the site had been used as a filming location for blockbuster movies like Jurassic World, Percy Jackson, and Planet of the Apes. There was something almost otherworldly about an abandoned amusement park. Abandoned Six Flags New Orleans is eerie in the same way that the Pripyat amusement park is. Places that were constructed for the sole purpose of offering people joy deteriorated and overtaken by nature due to truly terrifying disasters. 2016, another group displayed interest in reopening the original Jazzland and adding additional attractions in the coming years, but it was cancelled in 2018 due to the near impossibility of cleaning up the mess that Katrina left on the site. But still, despite the constant flow of failure we've seen from groups attempting to redevelop the park, another challenger stepped up. Bayou Phoenix partnered with the city of New Orleans to plan for a site fit with a water park, a pair of hotels, a sports facility, and a shopping outlet. And on March 7, 2023, an official agreement was made for Bayou Phoenix to redevelop the park. I have little doubt that eventually the deal will fall through, leaving Six Flags New Orleans' abandoned plot left unprotected from the grasps of nature for nearly a generation. By September, there will be humans who have reached literal adulthood without having even existed at the same time as Six Flags New Orleans. Of course, there was no natural disaster that killed the Astrodomain. In fact, the Astrodome's lifespan was actually extended a few weeks due to thousands of evacuees who fled Hurricane Katrina. But after that, the Astrodome's time was up. The stadium was deemed a fire risk in 2008 and has been sitting vacant for more than 15 years. One of the most iconic venues in sports history simply lies in the shadow of its heir, perhaps waiting for its inevitable demise, but hopefully for its restoration and preservation into the distant future. With the closure of Astroworld, Houston became, and still remains, the largest US city without a major theme park. The closest they have to a replacement of Astroworld is probably the Galveston Pier, but in terms of scale, there are no current comparisons. I think most have accepted that a true successor to Astroworld is never coming. And as for Six Flags New Orleans, it's already been proven that attempts to revive what there once was are doomed to repeat an endless cycle of failure. Perhaps in another world, this is the end of the story, but there's one more thing that's left unaddressed. I imagine that most watching the video had heard about Astroworld, just not the Astroworld I was referring to. On August 3rd, 2018, Travis Scott dropped arguably the biggest album of the year, and it just happened to be called Astroworld. Scott, a Houston native, had attended the park as a kid and named the album after the defunct park. The album saw immediate success and went quadruple platinum in the United States, and sparked renewed interest in Astroworld. From out of nowhere, people cared about Astroworld again, just in a different way. It breathed new life into the park almost 13 years after its closure, but it also sort of took the identity that it had too. Because after the album dropped, no longer were the days of Astroworld being known simply as a defunct park in Houston. It was now known widely for being the name of an album. But that doesn't mean people didn't miss Astroworld any less. Looking at almost any old videos of the park, you can easily find dozens of comments reminiscing about their time at Astroworld. People really loved this place, and it was nice to have an album immortalize the name of the park. There was even an annual festival for Travis Scott to perform his hit songs in front of tens of thousands of people. It was called the Astroworld Festival. It was first held in 2018, then it was held again in 2019. It was cancelled in 2020 due to COVID, but in 2021, disaster struck at about 9 p.m. when hundreds of people rushed towards the stage to see Travis Scott right after he took the stage. It ultimately resulted in the death of 10 people, aged 9 to 27, and caused hospitalizing injuries to additional 25 people. It was a whole mess, between Scott's apology and how the whole event could have so easily been prevented. It was horrible. And once again, the Astroworld name was redefined, now forever tainted. Instead of being a word that sparks joy, it is one that likely reminds us of the tragedy that occurred. None of the two parks could have a normal ending. The abandoned remnants of Six Flags New Orleans can still be seen from Interstate 510 due to everyone's inability to even begin the cleanup of Katrina's mess. Six Flags Astroworld was reduced to a mostly unused parking lot, then got swept into irrelevance by an album combined with a fatal crowd crush. They are gone and they are not coming back. The only thing we can do now is look back at everything and wonder if they were doomed from the beginning. But we should enjoy what we have now, because In an instant, due to the hands of man or Mother Nature, it can be taken away.